Hello, this is Tangelo and me. We're going to give a little conversation, a little talk about Marjorie Suchocki's book, The Fall to Violence. So some of the work that we'll be talking about, you'll continue to read, and hopefully this will give you an introduction enough to help you understand what's going on. I'm wearing a necklace that Marjorie Suchocki made for me. You can see it kind of looks like an actual occasion, like the way she talks about actual occasions, which are the coming together of the past, coming in, swirling around as the present integrates the past into the present moment, and then projects toward a future. All right, Tangelo, I know you don't like when I talk like a professor. So, whoops. We're going to start with our PowerPoint. Screen. There we go. So this is Marjorie Suchocki's Fall to Violence. She's going to talk about sin. This is her constructive theology of sin. This is a picture of Marjorie and me. This is when she lived in Claremont, although I did just get back from visiting her now in Dallas. She offers an overview. This is an overview. I'm going to give you an overview of her constructive theology of sin. So what she's doing is she's taking how sin has been understood, and she's evaluating it and seeing that there are problems with it. And then she's offering her own constructive theology of sin that fits better with the questions and issues as they are arising that she sees in the church, and connects it then with the tradition. First of all, she sees sin as best understood in terms of its horizontal impact, the way that sin impacts each other, how our actions impact those around us. That could be our environment, the birds around us, our neighbors, the people we don't know, as opposed to simply looking at sin as directly as how it affects God. She says sin is when our actions violate the well-being of others and ourselves. This violation is violence, and it can happen through either act or intent. This violation of well-being is unnecessary. This is her definition. Sin is the violation of well-being as an unnecessary violence against any part of creation itself, and against God. So sin is a violation of creation and of God. This violation impacts us and those around us temporally. Not temporarily, like it only affects us a little, for a little while. It affects us in terms of the present moving forward. It affects us spatially and those around us, as those are around us, our neighbors, our people in our city, people in our state, people in our institution, people in our school, people in our churches. And it also affects the institution in the sense that it will impact the next generation goes through in a reverberating way. So this violation are like waves caused by a stone hitting a pond. And that's an image that she likes to use. But there is hope for forgiveness. You'll see in the second half of the book, that is enabled by God to repair and transcend toward truth, love, and beauty. I want you to note the preference. The structure of the book is given in the preference, and it's very important and helpful. She offers a critique. Sin is the experience of suffering and pain that is caused by humans, and that is the problem that should be addressed by theology. This is what she's naming as sin. She critically examines the classical formulations and meanings of original sin. Now, folks have understood, have often thought of original sin as something that is passé and something to be laughed at. Ha ha. She says no. Perhaps the metaphysical confusions that our forefathers have created to talk about original sin may be problematic, but the notion that sin is something that is inherited, that we are continually affected by the sins of our fathers and forefathers, our ancestors, and that sin continues to impact us. It puts us in, we are starting off in a situation in which sin is rampant, and the impact of sin is rampant. And thus, there is no one who can start off innocent. There's no one who can start off without having to deal with the issues that sin and violence have created. She reflects upon the current view of sin, the ways from her perspective, and also from the perspective of those who are suffering from the violence that has occurred to them, both those who are perpetuating the violence, those who are acting violently, and also those who are suffering and being violated. She studies the tradition, both the ancient tradition and our current, more recent tradition, for common situations, responses, and analysis to this issue of sin and violence and problems in human. What is wrong with us? Why can't we all just get along with God's values? Further, she formulates a contemporary conceptualization of the tradition's enduring insights, right? So she's looking at what's important about what the tradition has said, and what are those enduring insights, those things that it said about original sin and inherited sin that can be helpful for the way that we can and can speak to our current problems and issues. She says original sin speaks of conditions that have already been present, and they've been operating long before any of us were born, and yet we grow up participating in them and in the pain of suffering of ourselves and of others that we participate in, contribute to, and suffer from. Now, the structure of her book is given in the introduction, so I encourage you to take a look at that book right now. Pick it up, look at it, open it up, and look at what she says about this. And I want you to read what she says in the preface. I want you to read it 3 times. So go ahead and do that right now. So I hope you were able to look at that. I think it's important to look at what she says about the structure of the book, and hopefully it makes more sense to you. And I hope that you will look over that again, because she says a lot in that structure. She tells you exactly what she's going to do. So I'm going to invite you to look at that throughout as you're reading. She gives she sets up the problem that the book is responding to, and that is the discussion about sin and suffering, which she's naming as about the violence of a violator against a human victim or toward a human victim. She gives the critical exploration of what the tradition has said about sin and about original sin in particular. She looks particularly to Augustine and Reinhold Niebuhr, who are 2 very important theologians, authors of how original sin and sin has been and is continued to be understood in Christian theology and in many Christian churches. It is known and seen as some sort of rebellion against sin, is rebellion against God through disobedience, through pride, through violating whatever it is that God tells us to do. Disobedience and doing it out of pride. She offers a critique of this formulation of sin. And the main critique is that it does not attend to those who suffer the most, and that is humans and creatures. It's focused primarily upon the impact upon God. You're sinning against God, when in fact, The harm that is happening, which can be seen and named and known, is a harm that is happening against or toward our neighbors, our strangers, other people, other creatures, and ourselves, as well as God. Because whatever occurs and happens and violates me is also harming, making God feel that suffering as well. So her revised formulation of sin is a rebellion against creation through unnecessary violence. It's creation that suffers the most from sin. Sin is understood in terms of the violence that's done to those right in front of us. This focus then in our analysis of sin is not upon the direct impact upon God per se, but it's upon its direct impact upon our neighbors, loved ones, strangers, other creatures, and ourselves. And we'll see in her theology that as we impact directly the ram, as we impact others, we are also impacting God, because God is intimate within each of us, within me and within you, within our neighbors, within those who we have harmed. So as we are harming others in front of us, we are also harming God, because God is experiencing what they're experiencing, knowing them intimately as God knows us intimately. So I encouraged you to look at their introduction, but I also encourage you to look at and refer back to the outline of her chapters. You'll notice she's going to begin in this theological, her part 1 is theological foundations of sin. How has sin been understood, and how could it be understood in a better way, a way that is more effective for our modern, postmodern world, but in fact, more effective for what it is we are called to do as Christians. And then part 2, she's going to look at the structure of original sin. She looks at that, and she uses process philosophy and theology to help us understand looking at sin in this with this horizontal lens. We're also looking at the way in which we as humans are called to transcend. We are called to self-transcend, and the violation of that, the ignoring that transcendence, is part of the way we understand the ways in which we fail. And thus sin is understood as a violation of that ability to transcend. We have an ability to transcend through memory. I transcend my momentary being through remembering who I've been in the past, who others have been in the past to me. I transcend by empathy. I imagine and feel and experience the feelings of others. I think about and put myself in the situation of another person. And then through imagination, imagining the ways in which things could be different. How can we make things different then? We imagine what it is and then work to figure out what steps do we need to take to make it different. And those are her understandings of the horizontal transcendence. And when those fail us, we see that sin is impacting us in those ways as well. I live downtown, so there are motorcycles that go by, even though that sounds like an airplane. So we will continue looking at the structure of our argument. So here's an explanation of process. We'll have an explanation of process theology's view of God and creation, and seeing the way that God and creation are internally related to each other. And then we'll also look at her criteria, her way of understanding how do we know what is good. And that is, she gets that from the Bible, shalom. She understands shalom to be not simply peace, but rather a sense of a well-being, an inclusive well-being, a well-being and a prosperity toward the future. And she names this as the criteria for judging violence and violation. She also is, in addition to the Hebrew Bible, and Jesus talks about this as well, she also is reprising Julian of Norwich's "All shall be well" in her vision of God, God telling her, all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, to conceive of salvation. More about Julian of Norwich, perhaps in class, if you're interested. Now, she looks at the trifold structure of inherited sin. So the second part of the book, which we'll be doing next time, we will have some lead us in a discussion as well. And we'll talk about evolution and the way in which we have inherited violence. We have inherited this need to have violence, and that all violence is not bad, but there are ways in which we can talk about violence that are the way we can understand violence, that can name it and analyze it and evaluate it as problematic. Then we'll also talk about solidarity of every individual human, and that what I do impacts all of those around me, just like the pebbles in the water, the waves. So what one person does affects others, even without necessarily being conscious or intentional about that. These structures of intersubjectivity is what she's talking about this. She'll talk about this in terms of process theology as well, because we are all interconnected with each other. We are constituted by our relationship with each other and our relationships with our own past, in our engagements and God's presence in and amidst all of those relations. And then third, she'll talk about the social inheritance, the way in which sin is part of the structure of of our institutions and what we have inherited from the past, and how to engage this responsibly. She'll then just talk about guilt and forgiveness and grace. This is a constructive response and an offering, and she is offering a revision of sin, a re-envisioning of sin that engages process theology to help us revise the ancient doctrine of original sin for what we now have, a relational worldview. Part 1, the theological foundations of sin. Now, here is one of the things she takes from the tradition and highlights. She says that sin is here before we get here. It affects us before we even have a chance to become conscious or critical concerning it. She talks about her definitions of sin. She's very clear about this, and she says it several times. This is a picture of Marjorie, by the way. This is a picture of Marjorie with Tangelo. And sin is the participation through intent or act in unnecessary violence that contributes to the ill-being of any aspect of earth and its inhabitants. So I encourage you to reflect back on that, maybe write that down on a postcard or one of those little cards, a Post-it or something like that, and keep that in mind as you're reading her. It is the violation of creation's well-being. What is sin? Original or inherited, and what are particular sins? What are the differences and similarities between them? She's going to talk about this terminology, which is helpful as we're discussing it and you're reading it. So there's sin with without an S, and then there are sins, individual sins. So there's the notion of sin, which is the root or formula of sin itself, is relevant for the question of original sin and for the general foundation of sin. It's a normative way of talking about what is sin at its root, and then how all the other sins can be understood in relation to that. Sins are particular acts such as stealing or cheating or hitting someone, killing, etc. There are a variety of ways of understanding sin and sins. Augustine and Niebuhr develop a paradigm of sin in which sin is understood as a rebellion against God, that is desiring that which is not God more than God. Now that is a norm that has become a normative way of talking about sin, desiring that which is not God more than one desires God. I encourage you to reflect upon that. Sin, without an S, is a foundational way of understanding all sins with an S. Now she's going to critique the traditional notions and definitions of sin. Adam and Eve figure in that. And just as an excursus here, the notion of Adam and Eve is, you don't have to take Adam and Eve as the original people that are in the story in Genesis as an historical historically accurate depiction of the beginning of humanity. I think most of us probably realize that snakes don't talk. But the notion that we're all descended from Adam and Eve is an important one in the Hebrew and Jewish tradition as well, proclaiming and reminding us that we are all humans are interrelated. We are all sisters, brothers, cousins, second cousins, third cousins. We are all related to each other because we are all descended from the same. In the story of Adam and Eve, which is talked about in a mythological terms, sin is understood as personal disobedience. And both Niebuhr and Augustine, as well as others, Aquinas and others, talk about this and highlight this as a paradigm in which we can talk about sin and understand sin. It is the willful violation of God's moral law. Here, sin is understood as more immorality, but is really understood as disobedience, as rebelling against God's authority to give us law, not just obeying one rule, such as not eating the pomegranate, because it was probably more likely a pomegranate than an apple. And this may remind those of you who know Greek mythology about the prohibition of eating even one pomegranate seed, while Hera transversed Hades to try to find Hera, to try to find her lost daughter. Hera is the Roman, it isn't Greek. Thus, when analyzed further, original sin is formulated in this traditional way as rebellion against God, rebellion against God's authority. This is problematic, according to Suchocki, and she names the ways in which it is problematic. She lists these. There's a variety of ways of thinking about this. The problem here, it reduces God to a moral lawgiver, as if that's all God's about. Here's the moral law, keep it or I'll punish you. It keeps the marginalized, those persons who are already marginalized, in the same status quo of being marginalized, because it ignores the ways in which our actions or unactions violate the well-being of those around us in a variety of different social situations, particularly those who are marginalized. It levels and equalizes sin, making murder of a child equal to stealing a pomegranate. It renders the real victims invisible. The sin of murdering a child is not the child, is not seen as the mother, but rather is violating the law that God gave. It actually does foster, it devalues creation itself. Looking at, doesn't matter what happened or it's only secondarily important what happened to the child, only secondary important what happened to the oil field or the Alaskan wildlife. Because what's really important is that you disobeyed what God said to do. It renders the real victims invisible. It actually fosters a sin of pride or absolute knowledge and self-righteousness. I know what's right and wrong because God told me. It's too abstract from everyday experience. It's probably not what you think about when you're thinking about, should I do this or should I do that? Or when you reflect upon the ways in which maybe you have not lived up to what you wanted to live up to last night, that day. Did you think about the ways in which God's law was violated? Or did you think about the ways in which a person that you cared about was harmed? Or a person that you didn't care about, maybe should have cared about? It raises the problems to a cosmic level and focusing on an abstraction rather than being focused on those right in front of us. And it kind of sees God as a jealous teenager who, doesn't really care or is concerned about others. It's just like, I'm the one in charge and I'm the one you're supposed to be giving homage to. And this notion of sin also doesn't enable us to care for others directly, but only, be nice to each other because God wants you to. Now, Suchocki highlights Augustine and Niebuhr's formulations of original sin in the next section. Both of them articulate sin as rebellion against God. Original sin in Augustine and Niebuhr is understood as rebellion against God and against God-given limitations. Satan falls from God's grace because Satan violates God-given limitations and wants to be the one who is adored. The angels in Augustine's view argues that, well, sin argues that, Augustine argues that sin is written in heavenly dispute of certain angels who turned away from the adoration of God, which connected to them to the very source of life, and turned toward their own nature. And in turning toward their own nature, this rebellion resulted in them falling, particularly Satan, falling from heaven, and in turn then tempting Adam and Eve to also rebel against God's law. This parallels Augustine's understanding of the ontological paradigm of rebellion, of the faculty of the human will that rebels against the human faculties of the contemplative and practical minds, and thus they fall to lust for the finite thing, like a woman, rather than desiring the infinite God. And I've drawn a picture of this very poorly, I know, but it's hard to draw with on the computer. They don't give you a lot of options, and maybe other people know how to do it better, but this is what I got. Right. So this is one of the ways, that Augustine conceptualizes sin. So this is a person, and he thinks of people as male because he's male. And so he sees things from a male perspective. And a person is made up of, the soul is made up of these three elements, this trinity within the soul. Remember Augustine, well, maybe you don't remember because you haven't studied Augustine, but for Augustine, the trinity of God is reflected in the trinity of the person, of the soul. And that is the contemplative mind, the practical mind, and the will. And the contemplative mind is focused on contemplating God. The practical will listens to what we need to do in order to, you want us to contemplate God, but I need to do the laundry and make sure you get some food. So the practical mind figures out how to do that. And then the will is what connects the mind to the rest of the body. And it's the faculty that enables us to be moral. So I'm going to will, this is what God wants. This is what I need to do in order to live. And then the will is how I get the body to do those things that need to happen. Now, what happens, according to Augustine's story, is that the will rebels against itself. So you have some parts of the will that are listening to what the practical and contemplative mind say, and they're a little bit like generals and sergeants, and the will is a little bit like the foot soldiers, and they get distracted. So they have these directives about what they should be doing and attending to, but they get distracted by the beauty of the girl. They get distracted by the beauty of the world and say, oh, I'm more interested in that than doing these things. God inspired this direction to be up toward the divine, but instead the will gets distracted by the earthly goods and disobeys, rebels, and thus establishes a division, creates this division within itself, and this becomes the famous divided will that Augustine talks about of sin. Now, Niebuhr updates Augustine's view, and he talks about the human being as constituted by spirit and nature. So the spirit is the aspect of the human that transcends itself, that longs for God and longs to be more than it is, and it is constantly transcending itself. And then there's nature, which is the part of the human that is grounded in the world and what needs to be done in the world. And spirit, this capacity to transcend itself, sometimes this capacity to exceed what it has done before, to go beyond what it's to go beyond what it has seen before, the Captain Kirk part, to explore new life civilizations, to go beyond where it has gone before. That's Captain Kirk from Star Trek, for those of you who are young. And this vertical potential is what enables freedom, the spirit. And then nature is the limitation of finitude. So we have to acknowledge, according to Niebuhr, that we are indeed finite, that we cannot go beyond where everyone has gone before willy-nilly, that we have limitations. We have to continue to breathe. We have to continue to get our individual work done. We have to continue to stay in our lane, so to speak. So this limitation of finitude, this is the cautious C-3PO that keeps us from overestimating our capacities. That's the Star Wars. Oh, Master Luke, I don't think we should go there. Oh, Master Luke, no. Our natural abilities are limited. Indeed, God created us with natural limitations. And this is the horizontal aspect that keeps us grounded in reality and enables our eyes to say, focus on what we actually can do and can eat rather than on the infinity of perhaps, or at least the multitude of what's on the menu. Now, what happens when these dimensions, spirit and nature, get out of balance is when sin is problematic. This is Niebuhr now. This is not Suchocki, this is Niebuhr. These dimensions of humanity, nature and spirit, get out of balance, similar to what Augustine says. They relate to each other in a balanced way, which is very nice and helpful, except when they don't, and then sin occurs. Leaning too much toward the spirit, doing things my way. This is Frank Sinatra and Elvis Presley. I have to do things my way. I can't sing. This is the sin of pride. I did this. I ate, bit off more than I could chew, but I swallowed it up. I did things my way. Go ahead and look it up on the internet. And whereby one ignores the finitude, the limitations of nature. You go too far, and that's pride. You overstep your bounds. You're too big for your britches. Or the sin is falling back into what's easiest, staying stuck, frozen in one's natural limitations. And this is the sin of sensuousness, in which one gives over to the natural processes at hand, say following the crowd, or this could be, oh, I don't really need to get that done today. I'll wait till tomorrow, procrastination, or I don't really want to write that article. Now, these two pathways have been associated with gender, according to, and actually this is Kierkegaard's, this is the Kierkegaard part. He throws them in and sees that males are actually typically more prideful, and they will to be more than they are. So they will to be more than themselves, and they don't have a sense of their connectedness with God and their limitations. And then females tend to not will to be as fully as much as they could. And now, of course, this is 19th century and 20th century way of thinking about it. But females tend to fall into the sensuousness, following the norms of culture, in which males are named to be bigger than what they are, and females are supposed to listen to what the males tell them that they can be or can't be. That's why women are paid less, I guess. Now, however, Suchocki criticizes both of these views of sin. So both Augustine's view of looking after the girl and the rebellion of the will against itself, and Niebuhr's view, in which the person falls too much into pride or too much into sensuousness. And Marjorie's analysis here, you'll see if you go into it with more depth of understanding, is that even the sensuousness is really a fall into pride. I know better than what God does in telling me who I can be, or creating me the way that God created me. So Suchocki brings in process theology to explain and articulate how it is more effective and more practical, and philosophically makes more sense to understand sin and name sin as that which violates those right in front of us, rather than making an extended vector drawing to show how violating the well-being of my neighbor is sinful through some convoluted explanation about, well, my nature or my pride of being too focused on the way in which I can transcend the moment in the spirit, or I'm too focused on what it is my feelings are in the moment. These vector drawings that draw us all over the place, and finally figure out that this way of doing this and that are sins because they're harming or they're violating the way that God created us to be. And Suchocki says, instead, maybe we should just look at the way we treat our neighbor and see, is it respectful or is it harming? Rather than, am I disobeying what God wanted, God's particular rules, or how God created me to be with this complexity, or am I disrespecting God by having too much ambition or not enough ambition, which in turn is putting my sense of desire or understanding about God's my sense of understanding is our understanding of God really known in a book that was written thousands of years ago, or should we trust our own experience? Now Suchocki critiques Niebuhr and Augustine's view of sin more explicitly and pointedly. She says, as primarily focused on God. She says that these views of sin are primarily focused on God rather than upon the immediate victim, upon who was actually harmed. She accepts the complexity and the complex concept of a human being as a series of dynamic engagements between natural limitations with the lure of self-transcendence. She accepts that. Yet she grounds these insights in a biblical formulation and vision of shalom, which is a communal well-being. She interprets sin as failures of transcendence, as does Niebuhr, but she sees sin and the failure of transcendence as a horizontal failure of transcendence, rather than a vertical notion of transcendence. It's not merely limited to our relationship with God, but rather is related to it is more about our relationship to ourselves and our past, our present, and our future, and those around us. In other words, her focus here is in terms of world-related ways in which humans can and should transcend ourselves while bringing our personal and social nature into view. And that's a quote from her on page 43. This is a new way of naming transcendence, rather than the vertical, otherworldly way of transcending the self. She names empathy, understanding and imagining what another person feels. And memory, this image is a person's face, or that's a person's head. This is their memories. So maybe they're remembering music, because I think a lot of us remember music. We learn music by heart, or songs by heart better than we learn simply written prose. Memory, right? We transcend our momentary being by remembering who we've been and how we felt in different situations, to help us imagine for our future how another person might feel, for empathy, but how things might be different. We transcend through empathy, through memory, and through imagination. Those are horizontal ways of transcending. So I encourage you to reflect upon that and how you think about that notion of transcendence. Thus, sin can be known as a violation of the well-being of the entity that is right in front of us, each other, as well as rebelling against God. In fact, viewing sin as violating the well-being of a person or creature in our frame of view is a more practical and effective way of understanding and thus formulating her doctrine of sin. This will help us be more clear and direct in seeing the impact of our sins upon the entities that are most harmed and damaged by sin, by our violating their well-being. To understand Suchocki's constructive view let's take a excursus into process theology. So hopefully you can take a moment, stop, reflect upon what we've learned there, and see what she has to say about process theology as well. So in this interlude, this is a brief introduction to process theology. So some of this you maybe already have, since we've already read Griffin and Coleman, but God is known as an intimate and constitutive part of each individual, persons as well as other entities. And God acts by persuading us toward greater creativity, intentional relationality, and inclusive well-being. And God experiences our pain and joy with us. All of reality is in process, is constantly in motion, it is dynamic, and it's in relationship to each other. It's not this being separate from that being, but rather all beings are interrelated. You notice behind me we have celestial bodies, and those of you who know about astronomy will remember that one of the planets, Neptune, was discovered because of Uranus was closer and seen. Neptune wasn't. And people were trying to figure out, why is Uranus behaving in such weird ways? Why does it not follow a perfectly elliptical pattern in its orbit? And that's because Neptune is close enough that the gravitational pull of each of the planets impacts each other, and thus Neptune pulls Uranus out of its perfectly elliptical orbit. And so even in celestial bodies, even in the solar system, we impact each other drastically. All of reality is in process and in relation to each other, is characterized by God's engagement with us, which is a creative advance. God is engaging us, luring us, hoping, drawing us, inspiring us toward greater harmonious complexity, novelty, and freedom. And this freedom is sometimes understood as indeterminacy, or better named as indeterminacy, because it's not the freedom that is guaranteed by the Constitution for people, but it is an indeterminacy that is true about all entities and all reality, even things that you think are set, like a table. One could use the example of a computer because it is certainly indeterminate. It does not always do as it is predicted to do. Populi is another great example. It doesn't always function the way that the IT people say it functions. Process theology and Whitehead. Whitehead is the one who creates what we now know as process theology. He came up with a metaphysical system that is different than the metaphysical system of the Greeks and Descartes. And he critiques many of the underpinnings of Greek philosophy as problematic. He says they are outmoded, and yet they continue to dominate many of our philosophical and thus our common theological formulations. Much of our theology was written based on the philosophical and metaphysical assumptions and systems of Plato and Aristotle, both of which he's critiquing. Some of these wrong-headed assumptions that we find in perhaps our everyday assumptions that come from Plato and Aristotle is this. One, spirit and mind deal with ideas and virtues, and they are ethereal, and they are the only important reality. They're the only reality that extends beyond moment. Two, body and nature are illusory. They're not significant. They don't have great import. Three, the world is made up of unchanging substances that are somehow ethereal and static. And The world is adaptable and changeable only in its appearance, but in fact, its essences are eternal and static. Now, process reality critiques each of those and claims that we are all interrelated. We are internally related to each other, and we are interrelated externally and internally. We make up each other. Further, all entities are free and impermanent. It's not that God set the cosmic watchmaker God set a ball in motion and then everything follows one from the other with absolute determination. You can see that just in if you watch a windshield next time it's raining. Can't predict with absolute certainty where the next drop will fall because it is indeterminate. Now, process theology is not a dualism, it is a monism. In other words, both God and reality are co-eternal and co-creators. So it's not saying that your individual being is co-eternal, or that unfortunately the bird that I love and adore, Tangela, is eternal and will live forever, but rather that entities, that reality, that earthly being, that material is eternal, that matter is not destroyed. I think Einstein said that. And God is also eternal, is everlasting. And that both God and the world, the universe, the cosmos, are constantly recreating, co-creating together the next moment, the next way in which we are living, the next existence. So this is not a dualism in which there's a divine or spiritual substance and it acts and moves around matter as if we are chess pieces or checker pieces. All entities are dynamic and they're in the process of becoming. Further, in talking about God in particular, God is understood in a dipolar way. There is a primordial nature or character of God that remains unchanging, and that includes God's love, God's creativity, God's values, and then God's active presence that is in, with, and with us, that gives to us and receives from us and from all, and that's called the consequent nature. Now, I'm going to get to that more in just a second. Here's a diagram of the different ways in which different understandings of God and the world, the way in which God and the world are related, have been theorized. And we're going to compare those. So the first one here is supernaturalism, and it's also the same as deism. So supernaturalism is typically like, this is Calvinism, and I think many of our embedded assumptions might see that God is sort of outside of the world and God impacts the world. Unidirectional, God impacts the world. This happens, God makes it happen. There's pantheism, which was popular a long time ago and then has become even, has had a resurgence. And that's where God and the world are connected. They're the same entities, that everything is God, that God is everywhere. There's no actual entity that we would talk about as God, and it's personal God. And then there's atheism, and you notice that pantheism and atheism look alike. There's a world, but there's no God. Now, pantheism, that's different from all of these, and that's a combination of these, kind of. It is a synthesis, and yet it's complex. It is in which God and the world are interconnected, that part of God is in the world and part of the world is in God, that they are interconnected, but there's also part of God that is outside of the world and part of the world that is outside of the control of God. God influences the world, but does not control the world. God influences the world, but is not the same thing as the world. Now, process theology is pantheistic. God and the world are both distinct, yet they are intimately related. They constitute each other. But God is not God without the world, and the world is not the world without God. Going back to this dipolar nature of God, the primordial nature of God, is this part of God that contains the potentialities and possibilities, the qualities that are valued by God, with which God lures or draws entities towards the good. This is the reality of process and reality in Whitehead's famous book, Process and Reality. This doesn't change. It's the primordial nature. And this has all the possibilities. And then there's the consequent nature, and that's the receptive side of God. Those are the feelings and the whole. This is where God holds and feels all the consequences from all living realities. This is the part of God that is related with each of us. It is constantly dynamic, growing and changing as God relates with us. And the possibilities that God has, so there's a variety of possibilities, potentialities, I should say, but the ones that God highlights for us in any given moment are going to change according to the decisions that we've made in the past and the decisions that those around us have made in the past. Now, one of the other points of process theology is that there is not a plan that is to be followed in lockstep, because the future is open. Because in every moment, God's got to come up with a new plan, so to speak, for the next moment. It's not that God doesn't have a vision of what the future could be, should be, hopes will be, but it's kind of like has to rearrange it all the time, because we are making decisions that God did not plan, that God did not set up. Now, this is more detailed here, and Marjorie's going to talk about this a little bit, and if it doesn't make sense to you, just kind of let it go. But this is where she talks about this on page 55, in which each entity emerges into becoming as a creative response to its own particular past and to God's initial aim for that entity in the universe. Some of the phases of each actual entity, and this is called concrescence. So when she's talking about concrescence, this is what she's talking about. And there are three phases to every moment as it is concressing, as becoming. So we are influenced in our physical pole by other actual occasions, by other occasions, by their this is in our past. We are influenced by what other occasions have done, what their decisions they've made, and what we've done. Those influence those impact us. And then in our becoming, in the present, we have goals. We have, as we are concressing, we bring together, we integrate, bring together all of the different influences from our past, integrate them into this spiral of becoming, the spiral of becoming. And as we integrate that all this past, all these entities, all these other entities, we integrate them into one moment, simplifying, so to speak, and make the decision. It's the concrescence. And then we are satisfied. And this is this tiny little bit of satisfaction in the moment, in the present moment. And then as that present moment ends, there's a projective phase for what we hope for the next moment. So here's another way of looking at it, where the past actual world and all of its occasions come together in this moment. This is our contemporary world. This is the subject. And all of this is happening as God is influencing, highlighting ways in which this can be brought together and turned into the future. This is maybe a better diagram. So here's the experiencing subject that is the actual entity in the contemporary world. And now the ideal aim and the subjective aim. Let me just name those, okay? So the subjective aim is what I want to have happen. So that is what's happening as as the spiral is becoming, it's taking the past and its multiplicity together, integrating into one, and then projecting it forward. I use my subjective aim to do that. And the initial aim, yes, this is the ideal aim, as in McDaniel's view. The initial aim is God's way of understanding. God is present in this ideal aim, in this initial aim, in helping us, highlighting, luring, persuading us to choose this way of bringing all of these various influences together in the next moment as we're becoming. Now, existence is creation in every moment, and it is creation in threefold sense. Every entity is continuously emerging into a future from the past in the midst of the present. It is created by that which is other. It is created by that which is self, as I am deciding how to bring it all together, and I am influenced deeply by God. All efforts and energies of integrating and working together in every moment of each and all entities, God is present in that. The world is inherently, internally, and interrelated with God at all levels. What we do to each other is known and felt by God directly and immediately. So God is not only a part of that becoming of every moment, but then God also feels the decisions that we make upon ourselves and upon others, and the decisions that others make upon us. Even when a sparrow falls, God knows our heartaches and our sufferings internally. Sin against creation is thus also sin against God, and is felt by God. God and the world are interrelated. Process theology views existence as continuously other created, self-created, and God created. God and the world are constituent of each other. God is giving and receiving to and from the world and each of us. Thus, sin against creation is sin against God. Now, moving forward here in Suchocki's view, she offers a criteria of value by which we make these decisions, and that is the value is a communal well-being. That should be the criteria. We understand sin as rebellion against or violation of this communal well-being. That is the criteria that she wants to name as our norm for how we decide whether or not something is a sin. Is it violating the communal well-being of self and others of all? So this is a process relational theology in which God is understood in a relational way. God and the world are connected, and God's experience of the world is that God is suffering with the world. All sin against creation is also sin against God. Naming sin as against creation is more immediate and direct to our experience rather than naming sin as primarily against God. Thus, she says, sin is rebellion against creation or violence of creation. Now, she uses this criteria of well-being, and I encourage you to reflect upon Julian of Norwich. All shall be well, all manner of things shall be well. There's even a song that all shall be well, all manner of things shall be well. This is her vision of God. She sees a vision of God as she is locked in her one little room that's attached to a church. She lives through several plagues. That is nothing that is so much more intense than COVID. 60% of the people in her community died 1 year, and 4 or 5, 6, 8, 10 years later, 65% more of the people died. It goes on. There's a brief meditation that's inspired by Julian of Norwich, and I encourage you to look that up and to listen to it in greater detail, reading a little bit more about who she is. And I think you'll find it very helpful. God and being coming. This inclusive well-being, which is the norm, is that in every moment, God takes into God's self the results, the becomings of every entity, and integrates these with God's whole world. These are, God integrates them with God's holy values, and those values are truth, love, and beauty. These are the guides by which God then lures each of us toward the best option for the next moment, toward universal well-being. How do we know what universal well-being is? It is characterized by truth, love, and beauty. In other words, God integrates all concrete decisions, all concrescences of the past with the fullest knowledge possible and lures us toward the best future, projects us, persuades us toward the best future. And those best future is toward universal well-being, which is characterized by divine love, divine truth, which is complex, and divine beauty. Sin is a violation of primal well-being. Since the world is interrelated and interdependent with itself and with God, all becoming includes creation in relation with God. God is in us, and we are in God, and we are each in and with each other, as well as in and with God, and God in and with us. Sin is the violation of this, is not a violation of primal command, but the violation of primal well-being. It is not a rule, but rather God's hope for the world. Sin cannot be understood as a simple violation of one aspect of reality, for reality consists in interdependent and interrelational entities. Now, looking forward to the next section of the book, I encourage you to look at that. She is restating the problem. The human situation is one that is, we are stuck in a pattern of sinning, stemming from original sin, a condition that arose from the first humans, deviating from the God-given good. And this deviation has continued through human history, so that in our contemporary situation, these sins have accumulated and multiplied in unthinkable ways into this world through the violence and violation of well-being, through human solidarity, and through social inheritance. The next section will explore the ways in which the world is entangled in sin, violence, and violation of well-being in our immediate present and with those around us, and the ways that our genetic bent toward protecting those like us and fearing those different from us, and the very institutional structures that facilitate our being and becoming in the world also facilitate the continuation of this violation of well-being. The good news is found in understanding guilt and freedom, and God's presence with us in and through all, us toward forgiveness and transformation through willing the divine value, truth, love, and beauty, and enabling the well-being of each and all. Thank you very much, and we'll talk some more about this in class. Thank you. Please bring your